Please subscribe to the channel to watch the latest videos.
How the Biden administration tried to slow Israel's invasion of Gaza. In the days after the Hamas invasion, the president and his top diplomatic and military advisors balanced uncompromising support for Israel with concern about Gaza civilians and the worst-case scenario of a wider Middle East conflict. Within days of pledging rock-solid and unwavering support for Israel in the wake of Hamas's vicious October 7 attack that left at least 1,400 Israelis dead, President Biden began gently reminding Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that democracies like Israel and the United States are stronger and more secure when we act according to the rule of law. By the time Biden arrived in Tel Aviv on Wednesday, amid Israeli airstrikes that had already killed more than 3,000 Palestinians inside Gaza, an ongoing siege that left millions of civilians without food and water and preparations for a full-scale Israeli ground assault of the enclave, the need to buy time for Israel to think this through, in the words of one U.S. official, had become a core objective of the trip. Neither Biden, nor Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin or others in direct contact with their Israeli counterparts, told them what to do or what not to do, according to public statements and interviews with a range of senior administration and foreign officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity about the tumultuous and sensitive days of the past 2 weeks. But worry was growing in Washington, and its outreach culminated with Biden's 7.5 hours on the ground in Israel. In meetings with Netanyahu and his cabinet, the president expressed his concerns and posed questions. What if there is more Hamas resistance to a ground attack than you anticipate, and your forces get bogged down? What about humanitarian aid? How will you protect civilians? What about the hundreds of Israelis and foreigners being held hostage? What if the West Bank becomes a war zone? If Hezbollah attacks from the north? If Iran gets directly involved? And then came the longer-term concerns, something the Israelis, in their immediate rage, seemed less interested in contemplating. If you succeed in destroying Hamas, what will you do with Gaza? And what will happen to your hopes, and ours, for broader Middle East peace? Biden reminded the Israelis of the mistakes the United States had made as it struck out in fury after the al-Qaeda attacks in September 2001, he told reporters on Air Force One as he traveled back to Washington on Wednesday night. I cautioned the government of Israel not to be blinded by rage, he said. 2 weeks after the surprise Hamas attack, even as the Biden administration continues to extend full-throated support for Israel, it is trying to prevent the nightmare scenario of a wider regional war. World attention has already begun shifting from sympathy for murdered Israelis to concern for the plight of Palestinian civilians and criticism of U.S. support for Israel. Anger at the airstrikes and the long history of Palestinian suffering under Israeli occupation of both the West Bank and Gaza is boiling over in Arab capitals, with massive pro-Palestinian demonstrations and attacks on U.S. and European embassies. U.S. forces in the region, including 2 naval carrier groups sent to the eastern Mediterranean as a deterrent to outside involvement, are at risk of being drawn into the conflict. Missile and drone attacks against American troops in Iraq and Syria, which had largely ceased last spring as the administration renewed tentative engagement with Iran, have started up again. On Friday, a U.S. destroyer in the Red Sea intercepted cruise missiles launched toward Israel by Iran-backed Houthi militants in Yemen. Meanwhile, the administration's hopes for an expansion of the Abraham Accords, the Trump-era diplomatic rapprochement between some Arab countries and Israel, now seem indefinitely postponed, if not doomed. The diplomacy of being there. Even before Blinken left on October 11 for a trip originally scheduled with stops in Israel and Jordan, his itinerary had been expanded to include Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Egypt. In Israel, he repeated unbreakable U.S. backing for its right to self-defense. In Arab capitals, he was told of the need to rein in Israel's response and help the Gaza Palestinians, whose plight increasingly dominated global media. Austin had decided shortly after the Hamas attack that he wanted to go to Israel to demonstrate U.S. support, including major arms shipments, as well as to show potential outside belligerents that the United States was invested in the region. With a trip to a NATO meeting in Brussels already scheduled, he added a stop in Tel Aviv. It's a really important opportunity when you're there to really talk through how the Israelis are approaching what is in many ways a historic challenge, a senior U.S. defense official said in an interview. The defense secretary's October 13 arrival in Tel Aviv coincided with rising White House anxiety that events could spin out of control. When Austin made his low-key entry to the defense ministry via an underground parking garage, he embraced his waiting Israeli counterpart, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Austin, who knew well the challenges of urban warfare from his days as a four-star general overseeing the campaign to root out the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, had some knowledge to share. In their private talks, he urged Gallant to think through what they are trying to achieve and how to do it, the defense official said. At a news conference before his departure, Austin firmly took Israel's side, saying that after the attacks, this is no time for neutrality or for false equivalence or for excuses for the inexcusable. But he called for calm in the days ahead. This is a time for resolve and not revenge, for purpose and not panic, and for security and not surrender. Other Western governments, amid expressions of support, were privately delivering the same message. Our advice to them is and don't do it, because we completely respect their right to go after Hamas, and that means going after them wherever they are, said one NATO defense minister. So it's not don't do it, but it is think about what happens and have a strategy, not just a tactical maneuver. As Blinken crisscrossed the region last week, he stopped 3 times in Israel, which included multiple engagements with its war cabinet. Each time, he stressed U.S. support and understanding of what Israelis had gone through, but emphasized that we want them to think soberly about what happens next, a U.S. official said. Waging the war in a humane way doesn't just give Israel a moral high ground, it also makes sense strategically, said another U.S. official. Biden's historic trip. Last Monday, the White House decided that it would take Biden to bring the message home. As his trip to Israel was being planned, the first for a U.S. president in Israel's wartime, it was decided that Biden should also travel to Jordan, where he would meet with King Abdullah II. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, would also travel to Amman, Jordan, for the meeting, where Biden planned to emphasize his concern for the Palestinians and efforts to get humanitarian aid flowing into Gaza. Before Biden's trip was announced, Blinken participated Monday evening in what became a marathon session with Israel's war cabinet, seeking to wrangle assurances on humanitarian steps that could be taken to ease the suffering of Palestinians to balance the political victory that Netanyahu would gain from a Biden visit. Bibi, as the prime minister was widely known, was facing heavy criticism in Israel for failing to anticipate the Hamas assault and waiting days to meet with the family members of hostages. As Monday night bled into early Tuesday, Israeli and U.S. officials sat in separate rooms and passed papers between the two sides as they negotiated over the establishment of a safe zone for civilians in Gaza and getting aid inside. The issue consumed the better part of 7 hours, according to U.S. officials familiar with the discussions. When he emerged from the meeting, Blinken said they had agreed to develop a plan that would include the possibility of creating areas to help keep civilians out of harm's way. Pressed by reporters, he provided no timeline for when such a plan would be ready, or any details about how safe zones might work in Gaza, a densely populated territory where civilians and militants are nestled tightly together. On Tuesday, the itinerary for Biden's trip was suddenly thrown into jeopardy by reports that hundreds of civilians had been killed in an explosion at Al-Ali Hospital in Gaza. By evening, Washington time, U.S. officials said that by mutual agreement Biden's stop in Jordan was off. Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president, was returning to the West Bank, where he had declared 3 days of mourning. Sisi, whose agreement was needed to help secure aid to Gaza through the only crossing from Egypt, wasn't going to come. In Jordan, a close U.S. ally that had its own problems with a massive Palestinian population, the street demonstrations were growing, amid charges that the hospital had been hit by an Israeli airstrike. Welcoming the American president to Amman, it was decided, was not a good look for the Jordanian government at this time. Both Abdullah and Sisi were also worried about increasing calls from some quarters, including some U.S. lawmakers, that the solution to the Gaza problem lay in resettling Gazans permanently in Jordan and Egypt. Amid this swirl of anger and diplomacy late Tuesday, Biden left for Israel. He hoped to solidify and be able to come home with the details of Blinken's agreement that, at a minimum, would allow hundreds of aid-laden trucks waiting in Egypt to be allowed entry into Gaza, with mutual assurances they would carry no goods for Hamas and would not need to fear Israeli airstrikes. In a statement issued as he traveled, the president said he was outraged by the hospital explosion. The United States, he said, stands unequivocally for the protection of civilian life during conflict. As he began his talks Wednesday with Netanyahu and his government, the United Nations Security Council met in an emergency session on the crisis. In a vote on a resolution that both condemned the Hamas attacks and called for a pause in airstrikes to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza, only the United States voted against it. Casting the latest of many U.S. vetoes on measures concerning Israel, through multiple administrations of both parties, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield explained that the resolution failed to confirm Israel's right to defend itself. With the exception of Britain, which abstained, all of the United States allies on the council voted in favor. By the time Biden was ready to head home late Wednesday, the United States, while saying its own inquiry was ongoing, had confirmed Israel's protestations that it had not bombed the hospital. The explosion, both said, had come from an errant rocket fired by Gaza militants toward Israel. After he called Sisi from his plane, Biden told reporters on board that he had confirmed with Egypt and Israel that the first 20 trucks of humanitarian aid could safely enter Gaza, most likely on Friday. The clock is ticking, for Israel and Gaza. In the days after his return, it was unclear how much had been accomplished. On Thursday night, Biden addressed the nation on the situation, performing the now familiar balancing act between unwavering support for Israel and commitment to help the Palestinians. He said he was asking Congress for an extra $106 billion in supplemental funding, much of it for weapons for both Israel and Ukraine. A majority of lawmakers have called for unequivocal support for Israel, with many, particularly conservatives, advocating a gloves-off approach of maximum aggression and likening any calls for restraint to a betrayal of one of America's most important allies. Senator Ted Cruz, Republican, Texas, said on the Senate floor Wednesday that unequivocal support from the United States is critical, and calls for our Israeli allies to stand down are a shameful spectacle. Several Republican senators, including Rick Scott, FLA, and Marsha Blackburn, Tennessee, introduced bills to block humanitarian assistance from reaching Gaza or Palestinian refugees. Others, primarily Democrats, echoed administration concerns. The hope is that the conflict can be stopped from spreading by deterring Hezbollah and Iran, but also to make sure that Israel has some sense of what the end game is, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat, Connecticut, said Friday in a phone interview. Blumenthal spoke from Saudi Arabia, where he and several other senators from both parties had just landed for a multi-nation Middle East tour aimed at showing solidarity with Israel and stopping the widening escalation of the conflict. I think what the president cautioned Israel was they have the clock on their side, Senator Mark R. Warner, Democrat, Virginia, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, told MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell on Thursday. So as they think about this incursion into Gaza, how to do it, it's one thing to fire rockets or bring tanks or bring troops. It's another thing to actually root out this Hamas leadership with the most minimum casualty loss of innocent Palestinians who are living in Gaza. Warner said he hoped and prayed that Israel gets that right. As the world waits on what seems like an inevitable invasion of Gaza, progress on humanitarian aid and civilian egress remains scant. 2 American hostages were released by Hamas on Friday, with no assurances there would be others. On Saturday morning, 20 trucks were allowed to cross from Egypt into Gaza, while the United Nations said it would take much more to make a difference for Palestinians now without food, water, fuel or electricity for nearly 2 weeks. Another convoy of 14 trucks entered Gaza late Sunday, the UN and Israeli military said. None of the at least 400 American citizens inside Gaza, along with other foreigners and millions of Palestinians, have been allowed to leave the enclave. As scores of world leaders and diplomats gathered Saturday for an Egyptian-called Global Summit on the crisis, Arab countries condemned the killing of civilians in Gaza and called for a peace process, while the United Nations reiterated appeals for a ceasefire. Just hours after the Cairo meeting adjourned, Austin announced the deployment of additional U.S. air defenses to the region and said he had placed more American troops on alert to prepare to deploy to the region. A wider conflict is still a concern. On Sunday morning, Israel said that more than 100,000 of its citizens had evacuated the Hezbollah-lined northern border with Lebanon. At the Gaza crossing to Egypt, an apparently accidental fire from an Israeli tank hit Egyptian forces near the miles-long line of aid-packed trucks waiting for clearance to cross into the enclave. While Biden may have succeeded in slowing the start of an Israeli assault on Gaza, the likelihood of a grueling ground war remains high. Austin, in a rare appearance on a Sunday talk show, recalled that it had taken 9 months for Iraqi and U.S. forces under his command to clear the entrenched Islamic State from the Iraqi city of Mosul. In Gaza, I think you'll see a fight that's just a really grinding activity going forward, with millions of civilians stuck in the battle space among the mines and tunnels, he told ABC's This Week. In his talks with Gallant, his Israeli counterpart, Austin reiterated, "I've encouraged them to conduct their operations in accordance with the law of war." Missy Ryan contributed to this report. Drugstore closures are leaving millions without easy access to a pharmacy. Over the past 2 years, Rite Aid, CVS, and Walgreens have signaled plans to shutter more than 1,500 stores, and public health experts say there's already been fallout. After decades of expansion, the nation's largest drugstore chains are closing hundreds of stores as they reorient their operations against rising competition, a crush of opioid lawsuits and other forces, relegating many already vulnerable communities into pharmacy deserts. Rite Aid, which filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection last week, CVS, and Walgreens have signaled over the past 2 years plans to collectively shutter more than 1,500 stores. Public health experts have already seen the fallout, noting that the first neighborhoods to lose their pharmacies are often predominantly Black, Latinx, and low-income. According to our estimates, about 1 in 4 neighborhoods are pharmacy deserts across the country, said Dee Mikado, an associate professor at the University of Southern California who studies pharmacy access and health equity. These closures are disproportionately affecting communities that need pharmacies most. Pharmacies can be lifelines in rural or low-income areas, particularly in food deserts, areas that have limited access to healthy and affordable food. Pharmacists are often the most accessible healthcare professional for these communities, said Laurice Edwards, a professor of public health at Morgan State University who focuses on health disparities. But for national pharmacy chains, retrenchment has been a long time coming, retail analysts say, as increased competition, changing consumer behaviors, retail crime, staffing shortages, and minimal store investment come to a head. They're also feeling a comedown from pandemic-era sales of coronavirus vaccines, at-home test kits, and other products. The economics of running those stores have just unraveled, and they're not as profitable as they once were, said Neil Saunders, managing director of the analytics company Global Data Retail. Retailers are looking to offload them. Pharmacies facing whiplash. In a different era, the corner drugstore was the model of convenience, the place to not only fill prescriptions, but also buy snacks, birthday cards, and household staples. In the 1990s and early 2000s, CVS and Walgreens started putting down roots across the country, edging out the independents. Today, the nation's 2 largest pharmacy chains have more than 9,000 and 8,700 locations, respectively, and a combined $455.2 billion in sales in 2022. But now consumers have more options, analysts say, many of which are cheaper and more convenient. They're also more cautious as inflation, which shot up to 40-year highs in 2022 and remains elevated, weighs on discretionary spending. Now we've got players like Dollar General that's moved in, we've got expansion of supermarkets, and Walmart is more of a destination in many of these areas. So that's really cleaned off some of the trade of these stores, Saunders said. And moving more merchandise behind plexiglass barriers to discourage theft and violence has lent a dystopian feel to some locations. Front-of-store sales at Rite Aid fell 4.4% in the latest quarter. CVS saw a nearly 2% sales decline. Meanwhile, retail giants like Amazon and Walmart have beefed up their pharmacy and medical treatment offerings, and typically offer more competitive pricing on such household essentials as toothpaste, paper towels, and laundry detergent. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, whose interim chief executive, Patty Stonecipher, sits on Amazon's board. Nor has the sector been immune to the labor unrest that set off a frenzy of activism from Hollywood writers to Detroit auto workers. Pharmacy employees at CVS and Walgreens have staged walkouts, alleging that poor working conditions are putting them and patients at risk. Pharmacists, technicians, and support staff claim that increased demands on understaffed teams, such as administering vaccines while battling hundreds of backlogged prescriptions, have become untenable and are impeding their ability to do their jobs responsibly. Drugstore chains are shooting themselves in the foot by failing to invest in pharmacy staffing, Saunders said, because the pharmacy is the one thing about these chains that set them apart from other retail competitors. If service is bad or prescriptions are delayed, it will put customers off even further, he said. The pharmacy giants have sought to shore up their positions through consolidation and by syncing up with insurance companies in ways that steer patients back to them. Aetna patients can go to any pharmacy, but they'll get a better deal at CVS, which acquired the insurer in 2018. Blue Cross Blue Shield clients have a similar setup with Walgreens. Rite Aid has no such relationship with an insurer. Independent pharmacies with no corporate umbrella, which make up 19,432 locations nationally as of October 15, more locations than any one branded pharmacy chain, are also left out in the cold, industry officials say. This landscape of vertical integration of businesses across different services has put pharmacies who cannot participate at a huge disadvantage, said Mariana Sokal, associate scientist at Johns Hopkins University's Bloomberg School of Public Health. The urban health penalty. For Patrice LaVigna, a freelance journalist in rural Healy, Alaska, filling a prescription means a 2-hour drive. The town has no year-round clinic, hospital, or drugstore, she says. That means her husband, who has a chronic illness, must head north to Fairbanks for in-person treatments. It's a familiar trip for most of Healy's roughly 1,000 year-round residents, who use Facebook to coordinate trips to Walgreens, Safeway, Fred Meyer, or Costco. For us, it's a trade-off of living in a remote area of Alaska, LaVigna, 45, said. I think for the most part the community would prefer to have a pharmacy here. A rural area can be considered a pharmacy desert if residents are more than 5 miles from the nearest drugstore, Cato said. But in urban centers, where residents may be reliant on public transportation, the radius shrinks to half a mile. Though the number of pharmacies in the United States has hovered near 64,000 since 2014, there's been a distribution shift, according to Jenny Guadamas, an assistant professor of public health at the University of California at Berkeley. Pharmacies are leaving low-income and majority Black and Latinx neighborhoods and expanding in predominantly white and middle-to-higher-income areas, she said. Public health experts are concerned this redistribution could worsen long-standing racial and economic disparities in healthcare outcomes, too. It's what Edwards calls the urban health penalty. This has been going on historically, and that pretty much just exacerbates pre-existing health disparities, she said. It interrupts care and interrupts all the access to medical advice, access to vaccines, access to food, access to staples. Racial minorities in the United States already are at a higher risk of diabetes and high blood pressure, for example. Children in low-income areas have higher rates of asthma and mental health issues, Edwards said. And studies have shown that pharmacy access directly affects how closely people adhere to medication regimes set out by their doctors, Guadamas said. Seniors with complicated health issues are more prone to become dependent on a pharmacist with whom they have a face-to-face relationship. Patients have long-term relationships with their pharmacies, Guadamas said. When a pharmacy closes, they have to find a new one that meets all their needs, that takes their insurance and is affordable, but in neighborhoods with people of color and rural areas, they're just less likely to exist anymore. Pharmacies also offer needed medical equipment, over-the-counter drugs and food, Edwards said, and many also have self-service blood pressure monitoring machines. All of these things are coming out of communities that are already distressed, Edwards said. More closures coming. The retailers have also grappled with a wave of lawsuits tied to the opioid epidemic, which has claimed more than 300,000 lives in the United States since 2000. Walgreens and CVS reached settlements of $10 billion with multiple states, and Kroger agreed to pay $1.2 billion. Rite Aid reached a $30 million opioid settlement in 2022 with the West Virginia Attorney General's office, but faces numerous consolidated cases in U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Ohio and with the Justice Department. Rite Aid, which said it lost $1 billion in the months leading up to its October 15 bankruptcy filing, is shutting 154 locations of its remaining 2,100 stores, according to a filing Thursday in U.S. bankruptcy court in New Jersey. This includes 39 locations in Pennsylvania, 31 in California, 20 in New York, 19 in Michigan and 6 in Maryland. Many of the initial closures appear in suburban outposts of major metro areas, including Detroit, Los Angeles and Philadelphia. This is on top of the more than 200 stores the Philadelphia-based retailer has closed over the past 2 years. In a statement to the Post, Rite Aid said it is committed to improving access to critical health services across its markets. Our small-format store pilot is specifically designed to provide access to pharmacy services in pharmacy deserts and underserved communities. As part of its bankruptcy court-supervised store closures, the company that it has conducted additional research to help ensure we do not create pharmacy deserts in the communities we serve. Walgreens, which announced in June that 150 U.S. locations would close by the end of next summer, said in a statement that it is committed to driving equitable access to its pharmacy care and that it utilizes targeted pharmacy services like same-day prescription delivery to help underserved areas. We also engage in key alliances to reach vulnerable populations, as we have a long history of working with local churches, civic groups and national public service organizations to deliver life-saving vaccines to medically underserved populations. In 2021, CVS announced it would shut down approximately 900 stores over the next 3 years. From 2018 to 2020, it closed 244 locations. CVS did not respond to the Post's request for comment. Independent pharmacies are under pressure, too, due to many of the same forces buffeting their corporate competitors. A recent survey from the National Community Pharmacists Association shows independent pharmacies reported the slimmest profit margins since the organization started collecting that data 10 years ago. Upcoming changes to how the government handles Medicare payments could worsen matters, says Rana Hauser, Senior Vice President for the trade group. A rule taking effect January 1st is expected to reduce pharmacy payments, she said. Cash flow is going to be a real concern, the first 3 to 6 months of 2024, Hauser said. We are concerned that there could be closures due to this cash flow crunch, and we're very concerned about access points for patients. David Ovalle contributed to this report. He rushed from Maryland to Israel to fight. On Friday, he was killed. Rockville native and Israeli reservist Omer Balva brought a lot of light to the world. Omer Balva, a 22-year-old native of Rockville, Maryland, was back from his home in Israel. Then, during his U.S. vacation earlier this month, Hamas stormed southern Israel, kidnapping hundreds and killing more than 1,000. Balva's reserve infantry unit in the Israel Defense Forces quickly recalled him. But before his return, he wanted to gather supplies he knew that soldiers in his unit might need. So he and his friend Ethan Missner, who has known Balva since they were 7-year-old students at Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School in Rockville, went shopping. They bought knee pads, elbow pads, earmuffs and other supplies for the 9,203rd Battalion of the Alexandroni Brigade, Missner recalled. The two spent Balva's last night stateside at Missner's parents' home in Potomac, stuffing a duffel bag full of gear. A week later, Balva was dead. The Israeli-American was killed Friday by an anti-tank missile fired from Lebanon by the militant group Hezbollah while his unit served on that country's border with Israel, the IDF confirmed. He was such a loving person, Missner, 23, said Sunday. He brought a lot of light to the world. Balva, who grew up in the Maryland suburbs with 3 siblings, was among the 360,000 reservists that the Israeli military called up to battle Hamas. After finishing high school in 2019, Balva had moved to Israel with his parents, enlisted in the Israeli army and enrolled in Reichman University, Missner said. The pair remained in contact after Balva was deployed to the Israeli border. He said that he could hear bombs dropping at night and it was tough for him to sleep, Missner said. But on par with who Omer is, if anything he was more concerned with how his family was feeling, his girlfriend, me. He didn't want people to feel sad for him. The Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School community, including graduates, students, faculty, and staff, is completely devastated and heartbroken to learn of Balva's death, said Rabbi Mitchell Malkus, head of the school. Omer was a beloved student, Malkus said in an email. He was an unabashed advocate for the state of Israel. He is a hero to the state of Israel, the Jewish people and the school. We mourn his loss. It was at the Jewish day school that Balva, Misner, and a third student named Jagger Balkan became an inseparable trio. We'd do crazy stuff. Ethan had an electric bike, Omer and me would attach ropes to it and ride behind on skateboards, Balkan said. We did everything together, video games, basketball, soccer. We'd throw parties for each other whenever one of us had a birthday. Every summer, however, Balva would disappear, traveling to Israel to live with relatives there. I think that's part of why he loved Israel so much, Balkan said. It meant so much to him that this place existed that was almost a safe haven for all of us. When you love something so much, you instinctively want to defend it. During his last year of high school, as part of their school's program, Balva and other seniors spent 3 months living in Israel, touring the country and learning about its history. That trip solidified Balva's love for Israel, said several people who knew him. You could see it as soon as you met him, his passion for Israel and the return of his people to their homeland, said Akiva Gersh, who taught Balva and other high school seniors in the program run by JNF Alexander Muss High School in Israel. People were drawn to him because he was always positive with this big smile on his face. Always ready to go and do and help. The students spent time volunteering on a kibbutz, an intentional Israeli community where residents traditionally share resources. While most students rotated between stints at the farm and bakery, Balva spent the entire time working with children at the local school. All he wanted to do was teach the kids and play with them, said Balkan, 22. They just loved him. Another classmate at Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School, Emma Hawk, 23, has spent much of the past 3 days since Balva's death rewatching videos he posted on YouTube cataloging their senior trip to Israel. In one, Balva interviews his classmates as they take in the sights of Jerusalem and drop a few hip-hop rhymes along the way. Omer had a very contagious laugh and just was filled with love, said Hawk, a resident of Gaithersburg. This is just absolutely gut-wrenching. At the end of the program, while other classmates scattered to various U.S. colleges, Balva signed up for the Israel Defense Forces. Ethan went to Georgetown. I went to Penn State. We all wanted him to do the college experience with us, Balkan said. He even got accepted into American University and a few other schools. But he chose the IDF instead. He loved Israel too much. It felt like a calling, something he needed to do. Balva was proud of his Israeli roots, which he detailed in a class presentation on his family that still lives online. In it, Balva shared that his father's family had resided in the Israeli city of Tiberias since the 1400s and his grandmother had survived the many wars that ensued in Israel. Balva said his father immigrated to the United States in 1996 to join his brothers and start his own business. Balva said he planned to raise his children in Israel and had a passion to protect the land. When Balva enlisted at 18, he wrote Misner a letter to remind him of all they had shared as children and all they had to look forward to as men, marriage, kids, a lifetime of memories. He wrote that when he's having a tough time, he imagines us at 24, 25 with our families on vacation, just being together. That's the one thought that always put a smile on his face, because he wanted to start a family young, Misner said. During Balva's last days in the United States a few weeks ago, shortly before he rejoined his military unit in Israel, he talked to his 2 best friends about his plans for the future. He was going to get engaged soon to his girlfriend, who's from the D.C. area, Balkan said. He talked about working with his dad at their flour company, how much he loved that business. Balva's family could not be immediately reached for comment. His father, Eyal Balva, is the chief executive of Florination, a company based in Landover, MD, that imports flours. He splits his time between the United States and Israel, Misner said. The Israeli army has been positioning military forces along the border with Lebanon, about 115 miles from Gaza, amid an exchange of fire from both sides. That is where Balva's unit was stationed. Thousands flocked to his funeral on Sunday in Herzliya, a town just north of Tel Aviv, said Gersh, his former teacher, who was there. Balva's father and 3 siblings shared stories about him. A military representative from the IDF also spoke. He talked about how even though Omer had been at that village where he was killed for only a few days, already all the villagers knew and loved him, Gersh said. That was so him, he knew what he wanted to do and where he needed to be. And wherever that was, people always loved him. Dan Rosenzweig contributed to this report. Where China stands on the Israel-Gaza war and what it stands to gain. Chinese leader Xi Jinping last week called for an immediate ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza war. Making his first remarks since the conflict began, Xi said during a meeting in Beijing with Egyptian Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouly that the establishment of an independent state of Palestine through a two-state solution was the fundamental way out of the conflict. A few hours later, China expressed its deep disappointment with the United States for vetoing a UN Security Council resolution calling for a humanitarian pause in the fighting. It was a neat encapsulation of how Beijing is trying to promote two key diplomatic aims, bolstering its status as a champion of developing countries at the same time it is positioning itself as a superpower to rival the United States in a multipolar world, with some notable support. The previous day, Xi hosted Russian President Vladimir Putin in Beijing. Both have made a point of diverging from the Western-led support for Israel after the attacks. Since the October 7 attacks on Israel by Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that controls the Gaza Strip, China has been unusually ready to offer itself up as peacemaker. With Russia's war in Ukraine, Beijing stood back for a year before releasing a proposal for a political settlement. Now, it has launched a diplomatic blitz within days of the attacks, describing itself as a friend to both Israel and Palestine. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi swiftly called for an international peace conference to reach a solution to the Israel-Hamas conflict, and Beijing last week dispatched a senior diplomat to the Middle East. Zhai Jun, China's special representative to the Middle East, promised to conduct impartial conciliation and mediation. Despite Beijing's own long-standing concerns about terrorism, China has refrained in official statements from using that terminology when describing Hamas's attacks. In another contrast with the United States and its allies, China has said that Israeli retaliatory strikes on Gaza went beyond what was acceptable under international humanitarian law. What is the history of China's relations with Israel and the Palestinians? After a brief effort to establish relations with Israel in the early years after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, China openly sided with the Palestinians and Arab nations in the mid-1960s, when Mao Zedong's government provided weapons and promises of unwavering support to Palestinian fighters. After Mao's death in 1976, China began opening up to the world and softened its position. It normalized relations with Israel in 1992, beginning a period of trying to keep good relations with both sides of the conflict. Chinese diplomats would draw up proposals and call for talks, but they rarely got stuck in negotiations, in line with Beijing's claimed principle of non-interference in other countries' affairs. Under Xi, who rose to lead China in 2012, that policy has gradually given way to efforts to court Arab nations and offers to mediate between Israel and the Palestinians as China's economic footprint in the Middle East has grown. The president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, signed a strategic partnership with Xi in June. In exchange for Chinese aid, Abbas declared that China's security crackdown on mostly Muslim Uyghurs has nothing to do with human rights and is about excising extremism. What has China said in response to the October 7 attacks on Israel? Chinese officials have yet to directly condemn Hamas for the rampage, in which the militants massacred at least 1,400 people and abducted nearly 200, according to Israeli authorities. In fact, they have avoided even mentioning the militant group that runs Gaza and instead have said that they oppose harm to civilians in what they term the Israel-Palestine conflict. Their criticism of Israel, however, has been far more direct. Wang denounced Israel for going beyond self-defense and called for an end to collective punishment of the Gazan people. China's top diplomat has also intensified rhetoric around Beijing's preferred outcome of a two-state solution. The Jewish nation is no longer homeless in the world, but when will the Palestinian nation return to its home, he said last week. The injustice to Palestine has dragged on for over half a century. The sufferings that plagued generations must not continue. What is China's interest in the Israel-Gaza war? For decades, China stayed well away from the intractable conflicts of the Middle East, but that has changed in recent years. Beijing has tried to match its economic influence with growing political clout. That shift is partially to protect Chinese business interests, but also to secure support from Arab nations for China's efforts to reshape the world order in its favor. The fact that Palestine is such an emotional and hot-button political issue for the Middle East means that when China offers rhetorical support to Palestine, they're going to speak not just to the Palestinians, but also to those other Arab countries that want to see a great power support them on this issue, said Jonathan Fulton, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, a think tank. China has promised to send food, medicines, and other humanitarian aid to Gaza through the United Nations, without giving a breakdown of what it has provided. How have Israel and the Palestinians responded to Beijing's overtures? Beijing may have far greater economic interest in maintaining good relations with Israel. China is its largest trading partner after Saudi Arabia, but it has long sided with the Palestinians, part of a broader stance of support for those in formerly colonized lands against perceived Western oppression. Israel has largely rebuffed China's efforts to present itself as an impartial broker. When people are being murdered, slaughtered in the streets, this is not the time to call for a two-state solution, Yuval Wax, a senior official at the Israeli embassy in Beijing, told reporters on October 8, the day after the Hamas attacks. While Israel remains skeptical, the Palestinians have been receptive to Chinese involvement. Palestine trusts China and welcomes its constructive involvement in talks, Palestinian Authority Foreign Minister Amal Jadou told China's Special Representative, Zhai, in a phone call earlier this month. Can Beijing do anything to stop the fighting? Beijing's readiness to speak out and actively push for a resolution to the conflict reflects new confidence in its ability to resolve regional disputes. Beijing helped put the finishing touches on an agreement under which Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to re-establish diplomatic relations. The foreign minister at the time, Qin Gang, then offered to host a new round of peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. Beyond the Iran-Saudi deal, however, Beijing's rising interest in playing global peacemaker has had limited success. Its proposal for a peaceful settlement of the Ukraine war has gained little traction, not least because Ukraine doesn't see it as impartial. The sudden disappearance of Qin and his subsequent removal from his position as foreign minister hasn't helped spread Beijing's intended message of stability. China's foreign ministry has declined to comment on whether it will use its influence over Iran to try to restrain Hamas, and it has little experience working directly with the militant group. How does this play into China's broader geopolitical aims? For China, the crisis is a chance to establish itself as a dealmaker in the Middle East, win ground from the United States in an area in which Beijing lacks experience, and strengthen partnerships with Russia and across the Arab world. China's calculation might change if the fighting spreads, analysts said, but for now it appears to consider the current flare-up of violence an opportunity to strengthen its influence in the region relative to the United States. The way that this is playing out is not necessarily a bad thing for Beijing, Fulton said. If it remains a Hamas-Israel conflict, China can offer rhetorical support for the Palestinians, criticize Israel, score points on the U.S. while they do so, and it's not going to affect their greater strategic interests in the region. What informs China's views of Israel and Hamas? To explain China's position toward Hamas militants, Zhu Weilai, a veteran Chinese scholar of the Middle East, reaches back to the 2006 Palestinian legislative election, when the militant organization won a majority. Hamas has its radical side, but it's a legitimate organization in Palestine and is recognized by Arab countries, said Zhu, a professor at Shanghai International Studies University. It's not up to foreigners or other countries to define it as a terrorist group. Adam Taylor in Washington contributed to this report. Gaza gets some aid, but no fuel, as power crisis upends lives. Nuseirat refugee camp, Gaza. The Gaza Strip runs on fuel. It powers the enclave's hospitals, water pumps, and taxis. It feeds the generators residents depend on for electricity and helps fire up the ovens at neighborhood bakeries. But now Gaza, home to 2.3 million people, is almost out of fuel, nearly 2 weeks after Israel imposed a full siege on the territory and launched an air war against Hamas. The United Nations said Sunday that its relief agency for Palestinian refugees that operates in Gaza would run out of fuel in 3 days. Without fuel, there will be no water, no functioning hospitals and bakeries, the agency's Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, said in a statement. Without fuel, aid will not reach those in desperate need. Israel announced its siege and military campaign after Hamas militants based in Gaza staged a surprise assault on nearby Israeli communities earlier this month. The rampage by Palestinian gunmen killed at least 1,400 people and led Israel to unleash firepower in Gaza, where more than 4,600 Palestinians have been killed, according to the health ministry. On Saturday, the first aid convoy to Gaza since the war started entered the territory through the Rafah border, crossing with Egypt. It included food, water and medicine but no fuel supplies, according to OCHA, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Another convoy of 14 trucks entered Gaza late on Sunday, the United Nations and the Israeli military said, also with no fuel. The move to exclude fuel from the first delivery was an apparent concession to Israel, which worries that Hamas and other armed groups could divert it for military purposes. Israeli military spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari also accused Hamas last week of stealing fuel from UN facilities. Hamas representatives did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The United Nations and others are in a tough but fair discussion with the Israeli government over an inspection regime for the aid going through Rafah, OCHA's emergency relief coordinator, Martin Griffiths, told Reuters in an interview Saturday. He said a system for tracking the use of fuel was also being considered. Palestinian militants use fuel to propel the rockets they manufacture and fire into Israel, as well as for vehicles the fighters drive during operations. But fuel also helps power daily life here, as in elsewhere in the world, and keeps vital technology and machines working, from sanitation systems to cell phones to ambulances ferrying the wounded. Gaza's only functioning power plant shut down on October 11, when it ran out of fuel, blanketing the territory in darkness after Israel cut off its supply. In Gaza, a lack of fuel can now mean the difference between life and death. Health Ministry spokesman Ashraf al-Qudra warned Saturday that the failure to supply local hospitals with fuel was putting the lives of sick and injured patients at risk. The ministry has been reallocating limited amounts of fuel to hospitals to keep them open, OCHA said Saturday, and has asked people to donate their personal fuel supplies. On Saturday in Nuseirat, a refugee camp in central Gaza, 53-year-old Mahmoud Musalem wandered in search of a place where he could charge his Nokia phone, which doubles as a night light. He traveled with his family to Nuseirat from northern Gaza a few days ago, after the Israeli military warned more than 1 million residents in that part of the territory to leave ahead of an expected ground invasion. Musalem and his 9 family members evacuated first by auto rickshaw and then by a donkey-led cart. "We couldn't find transportation due to the shortage of fuel," said Musalem, adding that they took shelter in a UN school nearby. "And I don't know where I'm going to stay tomorrow." Israel, when it first declared the siege, said it would not allow any food, fuel, water or power into Gaza until Hamas freed the hostages it took during its October 7 attack. Humanitarian aid to Gaza? No electric switch will be turned on, no water tap will be opened and no fuel truck will enter until the Israeli abductees are returned home, Israeli Energy Minister Israel Katz said in a statement on October 12. Under intense international pressure, including from President Biden, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed to a deal with Egypt and the United Nations to allow food, water and medicine to enter through Rafah for civilians in southern Gaza. Netanyahu's office on Saturday said that it wanted aid to continue to enter Gaza through Rafah, on the one condition that it must reach the people of Gaza and not be diverted to Hamas. For years, Israel, which controls most entry points into Gaza, has restricted the transfer of dual-use items to the territory, including construction materials, chemicals, machinery and spare parts, according to the Israeli rights group Gisha. Israel has banned some dual-use items outright and allowed others entry with special permits. Israel has also limited or halted fuel supplies to Gaza in previous conflicts. In August, before the recent outbreak of fighting, a total of 1,200 trucks carrying diesel, benzene and cooking gas entered Gaza, according to Tanya Harry, Gisha's executive director. But since the Hamas attack, Israel has blocked fuel supplies for the territory. "It's clearly a potentially dual-use item in their eyes," said an official with knowledge of the negotiations over Gaza aid access. The person spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive negotiations. In Nuseirat, Sarah Saftoui is staying with dozens of family members in a single apartment building, after she fled with her husband and toddler from their home in Beit Lahia in northern Gaza. Their only power source is a group of solar panels, which she said provide about an hour of electricity each day. Saftoi's husband, she says, is a critical care doctor and still works some days at Al-Shifa Hospital, Gaza's largest medical complex. Fuel shortages there have forced many of the generators to shut down, and the power is now off in many departments, with doctors performing surgery using their cell phones or flashlights. On Friday, her husband came home from the hospital and couldn't eat, she said. The number of unidentified bodies was piling up at Al-Shifa, he told her, and the stench was haunting him. Without the fuel needed to power the morgue's refrigeration units, there was nowhere to store the dead. Berger reported from Ramallah, West Bank, and Parker from Cairo. Hezbollah steps up attacks, IDF says, fueling fears of wider conflict. Jerusalem, fears mounted Sunday that the Israel-Gaza war could swell into a wider conflict amid rising cross-border attacks on Israel's north from Iranian-backed Hezbollah militants in Lebanon and expanding Israeli airstrikes across the region. Syria's state news agency said Israel had struck the Damascus and Aleppo international airports in early morning attacks, damaging runways. In the West Bank, a rare Israeli airstrike hit a mosque, which the military said had been used as a command center for Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants. The potential for escalation remained particularly high along Israel's northern border with Lebanon, where the Israeli military continued to evacuate towns on Sunday in the face of more and more attacks from Hezbollah. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces, said. About 100,000 Israelis have been evacuated nationwide, an Israeli government spokesperson said Sunday, and another 100,000 have moved voluntarily. During a visit to soldiers in northern Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned Hezbollah that it would be making the mistake of its life if it chose to enter the conflict. We will cripple it with unimaginable force, he continued, saying the result would be devastating for Lebanon. Israel has fought 2 wars with Lebanon over the past 4 decades, the most recent in 2006, and tensions have simmered for years with Hezbollah, which the United States and others have designated a terrorist organization. Israeli authorities fear the group has been emboldened by the October 7 Hamas attacks on southern Israel that killed more than 1,400 people. Anti-tank missiles were fired from Lebanon into 3 areas in Israel, the IDF said Sunday. Israeli forces responded with tank and artillery fire and struck a Hezbollah observation post. Hezbollah did not claim responsibility for the attack. The IDF accused the militant group of trying to draw return fire from Israeli forces that could harm UN peacekeepers who are stationed along the border. The way it is looking now, Hezbollah is aggressing, and it is dragging Lebanon into a war that it will gain nothing from, Conricus said. Those concerns were echoed Sunday by U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. What we're seeing is a prospect of a significant escalation of attacks on our troops and our people throughout the region, he said on ABC's This Week. Because of that, we will do what's necessary to ensure our troops are in a good position, they're protected, and we have the ability to respond. On Saturday, Austin announced that the United States will send additional air defense systems to locations throughout the Middle East and transfer the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower aircraft carrier strike group to the Persian Gulf. The moves come after detailed discussions with President Biden on recent escalations by Iran and its proxy forces across the region, Austin said in a statement. The Pentagon reported several drone attacks on U.S. military positions in Iraq and Syria last week, causing minor injuries. On Sunday, the State Department said it had ordered non-emergency personnel in Iraq to leave the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and the U.S. Consulate in Erbil amid threats of terrorism, kidnapping, and civil unrest. Late Sunday, the U.S. Embassy in Beirut told American citizens who wish to depart Lebanon that they should leave now, due to the unpredictable security situation. Adding to the sense of regional unease, the IDF said Sunday that one of its tanks accidentally fired at an Egyptian border post near the Kerem Shalom crossing. Egypt's military confirmed the incident, saying it caused minor injuries to border watchmen. The cross-border fire, even if unintended, appeared likely to generate substantial concern in Cairo, which is determined to protect its border with Gaza and avoid being drawn into hostilities. In Gaza, meanwhile, 14 trucks carrying aid were allowed to cross the Egyptian border into the battered enclave late Sunday, a day after a first convoy of 20 trucks made it through the Rafah crossing. Another small glimmer of hope for the millions of people in dire need of humanitarian aid, UN Humanitarian Chief Martin Griffiths posted on X, but they need more, much more. The goods delivered Saturday were equivalent to just 4% of Gaza's daily imports before recent hostilities, according to the United Nations. Griffiths previously said the Strip would need about 100 trucks of aid a day to meet its most urgent needs. Israel cut access to water, power and fuel for Gaza's 2.3 million residents in response to the Hamas attack. Many there have been forced to rely on contaminated water, leading to reports of diarrhea. Some have begun drinking water from agricultural wells, which have high concentrations of saline, raising the risk of cholera and hypertension. The aid delivered over the weekend did not include any fuel, a desperately needed resource as ambulances try to stay on the road and hospitals struggle to keep the lights on. The leaders affirmed that there will now be continued flow of this critical assistance into Gaza. In a call between President Biden and Netanyahu on Sunday, a White House statement read. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, in an earlier interview with CBS, said the United States wanted a sustained delivery of food, medicine, water, but added that such efforts shouldn't interfere with Israel's war efforts. Freezing things in place where they are now would allow Hamas to remain where it is and to repeat what it's done sometime in the future, Blinken said. No country could accept that. At least 42% of all housing units in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed or damaged since Israel launched its campaign of retaliatory airstrikes, the United Nations said, citing Gaza's housing ministry. The United Nations also estimates that about 1.4 million people in the enclave have been internally displaced. Israel says it is targeting Hamas infrastructure and fighters, who are still launching regular rocket barrages into Israel more than 2 weeks into the war. 2 people, including a 60-year-old man, were wounded in a rocket strike Sunday on the southern city of Netivot, according to the Israeli Prime Minister's office. But Israeli strikes have also hit Gazan schools, homes, and places of worship. More than 40 bodies were buried Saturday in a mass grave in Gaza City before they could be identified, due to the lack of refrigerated space to store them, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, said. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, known as UNRWA, said Sunday that 29 of its colleagues in Gaza, half of them teachers, have been killed since October 7. Gaza's health ministry said at least 4,651 people have been killed in the Strip since the war began. More than 60% of the dead were women and children, OCHA said Saturday, citing the health ministry. The IDF has raised doubts over the figures, saying that failed Hamas rocket launches have also led to deaths inside Gaza, including a blast at a hospital Tuesday that the IDF attributed to Palestinian militants, a claim supported by initial assessments from U.S. intelligence. Israel has issued evacuation orders to 17 hospitals operating in Gaza City, according to the UN Humanitarian Office, but the medical centers have not moved people given this would endanger the lives of vulnerable patients. Israel has repeatedly warned civilians in northern Gaza to flee south ahead of an anticipated ground invasion, dropping leaflets several times in the past 2 weeks, including some warning that those who chose not to evacuate could be determined to be an associate in a terrorist organization. The IDF did not deny it dropped the papers, but said it has no intention to consider those who have not evacuated from the affected area of fighting as a member of the terrorist group. While many Gaza residents appeared to have followed the Israeli warnings, the United Nations said it has received reports of some civilians returning north due to continuous bombardments in the south. Nowak reported from Islamabad, Pakistan. Leo Sands in London, Claire Parker in Cairo, Kelly Cassilis-Cho and Nia Masi in Seoul, Sarah Dadouch in Beirut, Loveday Morris and Miriam Berger in Jerusalem, and Douglas McMillan and David Nakamura in Washington contributed to this report.